Story 3, Wild Card. The savannah spread out from the knoll in every direction, a vast, shallow lake of marshes and tiny islands, of lush green plants and tall tan grasses. Lieutenant Commander Hikaru Sulu stood on the knoll and breathed in the pungent air with a smile. Insects whizzed and buzzed and fluttered by. From time to time, one landed on his yellow protection suit, and for the most part, he either studied or ignored them. Once in a while, something the size of his hand landed with a sticky plop and started to gnaw away at the tough lev-from material. Then he pried it off with a stick and went back to enjoying the ecological splendor of Maris 5 under the bright yellow sun of its primary star and the distant orange dwarf of its secondary. Sulu almost didn't know where to start collecting. To his right were clusters of tall, vein-like plants of a reddish color, wreathed in strings of sticky ooze in which insects were trapped. At night, the veins rolled shut and the digestive processes began. Behind him were some large, white, yellow-tinged flowers that smelled of both chocolate and turpentine. On his left were low, wide-leafed plants bearing small, dark blue berries, which his tricorder said were mostly strychnine and lacrose. Ahead of him, at the edge of the grassy mound, which only rose a few feet above the marshy surface, was a nest of some kind, a long, hut-like structure made of leaves, grass, and twigs. He walked over and looked inside. It was dark, but something scurried about. "Mr. Sulu, report in, please." Sulu pulled his communicator from the zippered pocket in his protection suit and flipped it open.
"Sulu here, Uhura. What's up?"
"Better hurry back, Hikaru. We have only 2 hours until we sail on." Sulu sighed. There was so much to see and collect and report on. He felt like Darwin in the Galapagos, Alfred Russel Wallace in South America, Charles Lee Jackson on Rigel 3. Everything new and exciting, wonderful and mysterious.
"An hour, Uhura. Just an hour."
"All right, but I warned you. Admiral Kirk has finished a duty call on the manager at Automate 66 and is coming back aboard."
"Understand. Sulu out."
He tucked away the communicator as he looked over the marsh critter's nest. There was only one Federation presence on Maris 5, the Pyline plant on the other side of the planet. The clod there, he had noted, wasn't the least interested in botany, zoology, parallel evolution, biochemistry, ethnology, entomology, or any of the things the young Oriental officer thought important. Oriental? Asian officer. That was all right, not being interested, for after all, one cannot be really interested in everything, but to be offered the chance to study an entire planet and to refuse was, to his mind, almost criminal. On Maris 5, an ecology had been achieved and had functioned for millions of years without raising, as far as I could tell, a single intelligent life form. That in itself was not unique. There were millions of Earth-like planets in the Milky Way galaxy, and only a relatively few had produced intelligences equal to man's. But the ecology was a vast one, for it was nearly the same throughout the entire marshy surface of the world. That was unique, and Sulu wanted to know why. But then, he smiled to himself, I always want to know why. He caught an orange bug with brown wings and put it in his collection box and pressed a stunning button. Then he bent over and looked into the nest again. He caught the glint of eyes and drew back, pulling his phaser. He checked it to see if it was still set on stun, then started to crawl into the nest. The whole nest swayed a bit, and he heard ripping noises, so he backed out quickly. He examined the nest and realized it was floating on the water, tied to the plants at the edge of the shore. He didn't want to do any more damage, so he stood up and moved along the shore, inspecting the nest and making a 3D record with a camera. Then he saw a movement, a rippling of the water away from the nest. He aimed and fired his phaser, and the movement ceased. A blob of green floated to the surface, and Sulu walked carefully into the water and scooped it up in a naturalist's fine webbed net. It was just a gobbet of greenery, the roots to some plant.
"It must have gotten away," he muttered.
"Mr. Sulu, this is the Enterprise. Report, please." Sulu made a face, waded back to the relatively dry shore, and plopped the root system into his collection box. He plucked out his communicator and spoke rather testily.
"Sulu here. What is it?"
"Move it, Sulu," Uhura said. Captain wants out sooner. You're almost the last one.
All right. Wait until I decon.
He unzipped his decontamination tube from a waterproof pocket and sprayed it all over himself and the imperv plastic collection box. The hard ultraviolet rays would rupture the cell walls of almost any sort of plant life, and the other ray emitting from the tube would sterilize almost any bacteria known. He would be beamed directly to the decon transporter room and be bathed in even stronger decontamination rays, walk through a decon bath, and take another UV shower. He put the decon tube away and spoke into his communicator.
Mr. Leslie, beam me up.
For a moment, he was a column of dazzling, sparkling light. Then he was gone. There was nothing on the knoll. A bird flopped across the sky. Something splashed out in the lake. In the nest was heard a small series of faint, plaintive sounds. Lex, Nakashima, and Sulu bent over the microscope, adjusting a specimen slice.
There,
Sulu said, looking at the large 5,000-line screen.
Interesting, but nothing extraordinary.
Chalk up another one for parallel evolution in similar environments, Lex said. He bent over and looked at the insects Sulu had brought back. They had been dried and needed only to be mounted into Sulu's growing display of xenobiological specimens. Sulu looked at his chronometer.
Uh-oh, gotta run. I have a lecture to give the assistant navigators in 10 minutes.
Lex smiled. I'll clean up, don't worry. You want these bugs with standard mountings?
Yeah, fine, I appreciate it.
He paused to sign the small form attesting that he had followed standard decontamination procedures in securing the specimen, then shoved it toward Lex.
Sign that when you get a chance, will you? Look, I gotta go.
Then go. He waved Sulu off and turned his gaze to the screen again. Briefly, he wondered if the transporter's molecular reassemble could possibly affect a specimen. Starfleet stoutly maintained the replicant was identical, but the Enterprise had had trouble during ion storms and at other times. He shrugged and boxed the slide, then turned his attention to the strange little bugs Sulu had brought back. They had been killed with the adapted phaser stunning technique, then bathed several times with the ultraviolet. Quite safe, he thought. He picked one up with tweezers and prepared to mount it. He stared with sudden curiosity at the chitinous body covering of the insect. It was different from anything he had seen before, almost metallic, and it covered almost all of the sensitive body torso. You really have a pretty good armor there, little buggy. He put it under a Waldo'd magnifier and saw a fine dust filter from the edges of the carapace, but thought nothing much about it. It had come from a swampy planet. The insect was certain to have a water film of some sort. Time, decon, and UV had dried the film, and the dust was the dead effluvium left after the water had evaporated. All right, Nakashima said. Now for your moment of glory. Eternal rest in the collection of Lieutenant Commander Hikaru Sulu. Deftly, Lex mounted the bug, then turned to the next. He sneezed and almost dropped the third specimen. Too bad Sulu didn't have two of that first bug, he thought. I'd have loved to run that chitin through the analyzer. His nose began to itch, and then there was a sudden stab of pain. He touched his finger to his nose and took it away with blood on it. He blinked in surprise as he rarely got nosebleeds. Then the headache started. He tried to ignore it for several seconds, but it just kept getting worse. He dropped his tweezers and clutched the edge of the table in sudden pain. He cried out, inhaled, and screamed. Sulu pressed his hand against the wall plate, and his cabin door hissed open.
Oh, hi, Lex, he said to Nakashima. Sorry I had to run. You put everything away okay?
Nakashima nodded slowly. His eyes were wet and he seemed flushed, but Sulu didn't notice. He was washing up in the sonic shower.
Hey, Lex, he called.
Lex looked toward the bathroom.
Lex? What do you think of that midshipman we took aboard at Axanar, huh? Linda Chang. Isn't she something, though?
Sulu came out pulling on a fresh uniform.
Oh, that feels good. Did you hear me about... Hey, you okay? You look, kind of strange.
He put a hand to Nakashima's forehead.
Hey, you're feverish. I'd better get...
No, Nakashima said, and put his hand across his face. Sulu yelled, then screamed.
Midshipman Chang, I'm Lieutenant Commander Sulu.
Yes, sir, I know who you are, she smiled. She looked at Lieutenant Sulu and smiled politely.
I wonder if you'd mind coming down to the lab. I was looking through our dossier and I noticed something I think you could help us with. You have a degree from the University of South Wales in botany.
Yes, sir. They have a fine xenobiology lab there.
Exactly. It's right down this way. We ran across something on Maris 5 that we can't quite classify.
Of course, she said, smiling at the handsome officer. She knew who Commander Sulu was, all right. There weren't that many of the old Enterprise crew on board, and everyone knew who they were. They entered the lab, and Linda said, "Where is the—" She jumped as Nakashima put his hand across her face. She felt like acid was striking at her, and she screamed, then filled her lungs to scream again. "Oh, Lieutenant Langhorne, it's me, Linda Chang." His cabin door hissed open. She smiled wanly and said, "May I come in? Are you alone?" "Sure," he said, his smile widening. Scott looked up at the interruption, then glanced at his chronometer. There was no real night and day on a starship, but the human rhythm still required it. An artificial night was in effect. Most of the crew were off duty. He put down the control with which he had been scanning warp stresses in real time and pressed a communicator stud. "Who is it?"
Sulu, Scotty."
"Ah, lad, goodya." Scotty opened the door to his cabin and Sulu entered at his gesture. "A wee drop, lad. I have some fine Triacus pod wine. There's a bit of that Rigelian Dorf left."
"No, thank you," Sulu said and put his hand out.
Without thinking, Scotty took the offered hand. "What are you congratulating me about, lad? His eyes bulged, and the muscles of his neck grew taut. Sulu seized his wrist and held the hand of the powerful officer tightly. Scott's yell of pain became a shriek of agony. McCoy smiled as he lifted the pressure hypo from the arm of Captain Kirk.
"There you are, Jim. Perfect answer to the little weight problem."
Kirk gave him a glum look. "Changing my body chemistry so that I can't assimilate right-handed sugars seems like medieval alchemy, Bones."
"Perfectly respectable therapy, Jim. Davis completed a 10-year study. Read about it in the New England Journal of Medicine. The human body evolved using right-handed sugars. Essentially, it's blind to left-handed sugars."
Left hand, right hand, what does that mean?
"It means that when you send polarized light through a crystalline structure, one kind sends the light to the right, the other kind through the left. You can eat all you want, you won't feel hungry, but for about 27 hours, nothing will take."
"I'll starve."
"You won't starve. You'll have bulk. Your hunger center will be flim-flammed, and you'll lose extra pounds."
"Ounces."
"Exercise, too, of course."
"Magic, that's what it is." Kirk picked up the bottle from which McCoy had loaded the syringe. "I have batten, toe of dog, wool of batten, blindworm sting. Very hygienic."
Go be a starship boss. Leave me to people who are really sick."
"Who's sick?"
"Nobody, but I have a lot of reading to catch up on."
Kirk smiled and left the sick bay. He saw Nakashima and Sulu ahead in the corridor and smiled at them. "What's wrong?" he asked. "You two look as if you've just lost an election bet."
"Admiral Kirk," Sulu said, "I wonder if you could go with us to Lab 12.
"Why? What's up?"
"Something I found on Maris 5, sir. Can't figure it out."
"You want Dr. McCoy, not me. He's back there now. Tell him I'm sorry about his reading." Kirk started to step around Sulu, but the young officer grabbed his hand tightly. Kirk stopped. He felt a tingling and thought, the anti-static flooring isn't working. "What is it, Sulu?"
Nothing, sir."
Sulu looked confused. He dropped Kirk's hand.
I thought you were..."
"Falling," said Nakashima. "He thought you were falling." Kirk smiled. "Gentlemen, what you do on your own time is your business, as long as it doesn't interfere with the running of the ship. But," he leaned closer and spoke in a whisper, "I wouldn't call on Engineer Scott so often." Briskly, he turned and strode away down the corridor. Sulu looked at Nakashima, amazement in his eyes. Captain James T. Kirk came onto the bridge and motioned down Lieutenant Commander Uhura, who had the con. She sat back in the captain's chair and stared straight ahead at the main screen. "Everything all right, Uhura?" he asked. "Everything is all right, Admiral," Uhura answered. "What's our ETA at Omicron Theta, Mr. Sulu?"
14 hours, 41 minutes, sir."
Kirk frowned. "That's soon." He shrugged, thinking he must have lost track of things for a moment. His rough estimate had been 8 or 9 hours longer. Very well, carry on. Kirk left the bridge. No one spoke. Lieutenant Commander Sulu punched up another set of coordinates. Readout screens showed a different set of numbers, but no one said anything. "It's me, Spock," Kirk said into the door announcer. The doors hissed open and he entered. To his left, Spock sat in a black robe, meditating in a niche. Very closely, Spock came back to his present surroundings and looked at his captain. "Yes, Admiral?" Kirk waved his hand and took a comfortable seat. "Don't Admiral me, Spock. I need your advice." "Of course, Jim." Spock rose and stood ready, his concentration on Kirk quite intense. "Spock, do you sense something different about the ship? The people, I mean. They're quieter, more polite in an abstract way almost. I asked McCoy, and he said he hadn't noticed anything, but he too seemed, well, distant, as if he were thinking of something else." He cocked an eyebrow at the Vulcan. You observe everything, Spock?" "As an outsider, you mean?" "Your Vulcan heritage does give you a certain perspective. There's nothing I can put my finger on, but..." He shrugged again. "There's something. It's something I'm missing." He pointed a finger at Spock. "I recognize part of it. That feeling you get just before you go into combat, but there's nothing at Omicron Theta. I know just a scout ship has visited there, but the natives are at about European medieval social and technological level, 6 or 8 points on the human scale. Nothing extraordinary." But what? But I don't know. There's something going on. I feel it. The crew, they're distant." He frowned at Spock. "Did I do something? Or not do something that is irritating them?" "Not that I'm aware of, Admiral." "There's something going on, Mr. Spock. Think about it. Find out for me." "Yes, Admiral." "Admiral Kirk, please report to the shuttlecraft airlock area." Kirk broke his stride along a corridor and banged on the wall intercom. "This is Kirk. Who wants me?" "Commander Spock, sir." "Very well. Kirk out." He banged the stud again and turned toward the nearest turbolift, frowning. "All right, Spock, what is it? Have you..." The Vulcan held up his hand in a warning signal, and Kirk choked off his question. "Admiral, there seems to be a confusion about the safety procedure in this airlock. Would you inspect it, sir?" "Spock, that's the duty of the chief engineer." "He's busy, sir, and it would only take a moment." Kirk looked at his first officer, and seeing something in his manner, he entered the lock and the thick door cycled closed behind him. He saw that the lock intercom had been sabotaged and was useless. He turned to the Vulcan, raising his eyebrows. "We cannot be overheard here," Spock said. "Admiral, you're right. There is something going on. Mutiny." "Mutiny?" Kirk was shocked. "These are Starfleet people. These are people that..." Spock again held up a warning hand. "Nevertheless, it is my belief something sinister is happening here. For one thing, we are not going to Omicron Theta." Kirk blinked in surprise. "We are due to arrive at Psi Nu Alpha within 6 hours. Kirk searched his memory. "Isn't that where the Sisters of the Sacred Heart have a monastery?" "Yes, there's a small Terran colony there as well. It is well out of the normal trade routes. In fact, it has only one interesting aspect. It is the closest planet with an intelligent population to Maris 5. Kirk stared at the wall a moment. "But why would anyone here want to go there? It's a rather bleak place, isn't it?" "Yes, by Terran terms. It's called St. Sebastian by the colonists, and indeed it is desolate, about on the level of Earth during the Plasthamic period of the Cenozoic, when mammals were just beginning to proliferate. Really quite primitive." Kirk chewed at his lip. "Why there?" "I do not know, Admiral. Would you like me to speculate?" "Please, Spock." "The only factor which seems to me important is that of distance. That is, it is simply the nearest planet with intelligent life to Maris 5. And there is another factor. I believe you and I, sir, are the only ones left untouched." "Untouched? Untouched by what?" "I do not know, Admiral, but I suspect a virus of some particular malignancy." Kirk said, But everyone seems so normal, Admiral. You were the one who pointed out the feeling of difference. I merely tested and extrapolated. Whatever the personnel of the Enterprise are, they are no longer wholly human. Then why am I not..." He fell silent and looked at Spock in shock. But how do you know I am normal? Or how do you know I am normal, Admiral? By logic, of course, and peripheral data. You, to my mind, are not different. I have tested several members of your crew. They are different, but in a way I cannot exactly determine. Not robot-like, not zombies, but they seem to possess a single-mindedness to the point of only minor functioning ability on the periphery of their awareness. I deliberately baited Dr. McCoy, and he refused the opportunity for one of his celebrated acid statements. Bones? It's affected McCoy? I'm afraid so, Admiral. Which brings us to us. I am a Vulcan. My body chemistry is different. I am not subject to some of the hazards those of human blood face, but you are undeniably of human origin, yet you do not seem to be affected. Question, why? Kirk blinked. I'm perfectly normal in every... He stopped. Left-handed, right-handed sugars. Quickly, he explained to Spock what McCoy had done. That must explain your apparent immunity, Admiral. He paused, thinking, which means you have approximately 12 or 13 hours of immunity at the outside. Well, what can we do? They still obey you, do they not? Yes, Kirk said. But if I order them to do something they don't want to do... His voice trailed off. Command, Spock, is a fragile thing. Ideally, men and women follow you because they want to, that they see a sensible reason to do so. It might be a matter of life and death, that they feel their best chances with you, or that you represent something they believe in enough to risk and perhaps even give their lives for. You may represent an ideal, a philosophical or social belief. Less ideally, you are power. If they don't follow you, something dire will happen, but if the crew is affected in some way, they must have a different set of priorities. Admiral, what are the first conditions of any infection? To identify, then isolate, then of course to cure. We have identified only in that we know something has affected the entire crew, except you and myself. We must isolate the injection, then. We cannot get within transporter or shuttlecraft range of St. Sebastian. Kirk looked at him with growing horror. It would spread, whatever it is. He shook his head angrily. If you carry that to the ultimate conclusion, it means we destroy the Enterprise, and as soon as possible. That is a possibility, Admiral. A final one, Spock. Surely things are not that bad. Perhaps an infection has spread. Maybe it has only made the sick ones distant, self-involved. Then why the secret diversion to St. Sebastian, sir? I have no answer for that. It's hardly a liberty port. We're out here at the edge of unexplored territory. After Omicron Theta, it's all uncharted. Exactly, Admiral. That way is unknown, but back toward the Federation centers there are people, lots of people, many species, billions of individuals. Kirk's face grew hard. Something on Maris 5 got aboard, but there's never been anything intelligent reported on that Marsh planet. It does not have to be intelligent, sir, to spread. All virus diseases simply feed. They multiply as long as there is a supply of hosts. And the crew knew there was a human colony on this St. Sebastian. That means, whatever this is, it can read minds. Perhaps it becomes symbiotic with the host. If it took over a Terran cow, for example, it would only be able to tap the rather bucolic memories of the cow. If it overpowers a human, it has those memories available. And all aboard know of the library computer and how to contact it and extract non-classified information. And there are some aboard who know how to get classified information as well. McCoy, Scott, Uhura, Sulu, Chekhov, you, me, Leslie to some extent. Kirk looked stricken. They know everything. The self-destruct mechanism, the ultra-purple codes, the security devices, the defense screens. Knowing and using are two different matters, Admiral. My estimation is that whatever controls the crew is on a simple mission of survival. Perhaps it evolved on Maris, or came there from somewhere else and used the life forms there as hosts. But now it has more mobile hosts, and it will seek to spread. Plague. In a sense, there would be no loss of life, just control. As long as the virus or bacteria or whatever it is was allowed to spread, then things would be left to proceed as normal. But if it was thwarted, Spock hesitated. This is all speculation, Jim, but this must be a primitive mechanism. It might simply use pain to achieve its ends. If it controls the body as fully as I suspect it might, it could cause unbearable pain to the host. Kirk was silent. I would suspect a subwarp message to Starfleet would not be sent. If we somehow managed to trigger the self-destruct mechanism, that would still not solve the problem of whatever it is which may be left on Maris 5. If we do not stop the Enterprise before St. Sebastian, it will spread, and from there to everywhere. That is a reasonable estimate of the situation, sir. The only factors to add to that equation are you and me. We are still in control of ourselves. For another 12 hours or so at least, Kirk said. Even if we did do something, they could immobilize us, even kill us before we completed whatever it is we're going to do. He grinned suddenly at Spock. We are, of course, going to do something, aren't we, Mr. Spock? A logical assumption, Admiral. If we assume that this invading virus can command the deductive powers of its host, we then must assume we are fighting our own friends at or near the peak of their reasoning abilities, which means they must have already disabled the self-destruct mechanism. They will then attempt to isolate or immobilize us the moment they suspect we are not cooperating, which is why we met in here, in an airlock. Exactly, Admiral. Do you have any suggestions? No, he breathed. Do you? Yes, we need data. I propose we isolate one of the infected members and determine the nature of the random factor here. Whom do you have in mind? Dr. McCoy. And here's how I propose we do it. Dr. McCoy, would you examine Admiral Kirk, please? McCoy turned from a blank screen and looked at Spock and Kirk in the doorway. Kirk looked weak and confused. What's the matter? He asked, getting up slowly. I don't know, Kirk said. It's embarrassing, but I have these strange sensations. Get on the diagnostic table, Admiral. Doctor, may I suggest privacy? Spock said. He is, after all, a flag rank. Yes, of course, McCoy said. He thumbed a switch. This is Dr. McCoy. I wish to have my lab isolated for a short time during an examination. Quarantine 1 in effect. Yes, sir, replied the recorded voice of the computer. The hatches slid shut and locked. Now, Admiral, if you'll... Spock used the Vulcan nerve pinch to shock McCoy into unconsciousness. He placed him on the diagnostic table planned for Kirk, and after a few moments' study of the electronic charts, turned to Kirk. He has 2 degrees of fever. His heartbeat is 7% faster than normal, metabolic rate up 12.5%, and his blood pressure is up as well. He's sick, but only slightly sick in a way. But what's wrong with him? Kirk demanded. Spock picked up a blood analyzer unit and pressed it into McCoy's neck. It hissed, and then he plugged the entire unit into the main unit and flicked on a screen. The Vulcan's dark eyes narrowed. He pointed with a long, bony finger at some nondescript blobs pulsing through the blood sample. Those are not natural to human blood. What are they? Spock flicked a magnifier higher, his eyes intent on the screen. I do not know yet, Admiral. Find out, Spock, Kirk said, looking at the closed hatch. Would they get suspicious? He wondered. He also looked at the camera pickups. I have an idea, he said. He took the unconscious McCoy from the bed and sat him carefully in a chair, propping him up and leaning his head forward so that he appeared to be looking into a microscope. Then he hopped up onto the diagnostic table and stretched out to wait. What we observed in Dr. McCoy's blood, Spock said, turning from the analyzer unit, seemed to be a rather unusual form of phytoplankton. Those are single-celled plants which form the base of the food chain. They're eaten by larger plankton, which are eaten by fish, which in turn are eaten by larger fish, and so on. But how did they get aboard? Kirk asked, sitting up. We have some pretty tough decontamination methods. Either someone was sloppy, equipment was defective, or it was deliberate, Spock outlined. All right, Kirk said, getting down and pacing. First, how do we kill it? Second, how do it get aboard? If we kill the existing... He turned to Spock. Phytoplankton, Admiral. How do you know there isn't more somewhere? Suggest one thing at a time. I will investigate how it got aboard first. What do I do? Kirk asked. I would suggest you go about business as usual, captaining the ship. Kirk cocked an eyebrow at his science officer. You know, Spock, that makes me sound a bit like a figurehead. There's nothing wrong with that, Admiral. If you have properly trained personnel within a functioning structure, it should be able to get along without you very well. Kirk looked at him again. Are you certain that is the answer I want to hear? Spock shrugged. It is self-evident. If it were not so, you would be at the control center on the bridge at all times. All right, Spock, all right. I'll go around showing the flag, as they used to say, and make no changes which will disturb them. Excellent, Admiral. Now, may I suggest you stay here until Dr. McCoy awakens? He might have some questions about why he was rendered unconscious by a fellow officer. Spock turned toward the computer terminal. The screen listed the Enterprise personnel who had gone to the surface of Maris 5. Galloway, the security chief, and 3 others, Friedman, Merlino, and Pearson. Admiral James D. Kirk, Lieutenant Commander Sulu in a separate transportation. Spock touched a communicator stud. Transporter room? Lieutenant Commander Leslie, please. Leslie? This is Spock. When Mr. Sulu came aboard, did he go through standard decon procedures? Oh, yes, sir. Mr. Sulu is very careful. He brings up a lot of samples and things for his collection, and he's very conscientious about that, very aware. Why, sir? He was alone. Yes, sir. We brought him up direct from some swamp. Thank you, Mr. Leslie. Spock out. The Vulcan's brow furrowed in thought. He ignored the awakening doctor and removed the blood sample from the analyzer. It was an accident, Bones. Spock didn't mean it. He apologizes. McCoy was rubbing his neck, but he didn't seem particularly disturbed. He looked at Spock and shrugged. But his attitude did disturb Kirk, who quickly took Spock from the unquarantined sick bay. Walking along the curving corridor of the main section, Kirk asked an impatient question. All right, what did you find out? That Mr. Sulu is the most likely candidate. Besides yourself and the security team, he was the only one to go down. Kirk stopped. We beamed down to the manager's courtyard, which is in a sealed dome, and never left it. I only saw the swamp from a distance to report. Mr. Sulu makes voluminous additions to his collection at most of the worlds we visit, Spock said. He hefted the blood sample in its tube. I think I shall do a little experimentation. It's a bacterium, he told Kirk as they stood in the sealed shuttlecraft airlock. I punched up what we had on Maris 5, which is not much. A freshwater ocean covers most of the surface, and there perhaps is a clue. Freshwater, not salt? It may not be able to survive a saline solution. But blood is salty. In fact, it's about the same level of salt as the oceans of Earth were when life crawled out of the seas. Perhaps that is the upper limit of tolerance. I propose we inoculate one of the victims with a saline solution. We will need to administer vitamins subcutaneously to give nutrition while the phytoplankton is eating up everything in the blood that isn't salty. Then, faced with nothing but salty blood, it may starve to death. Kirk looked shocked. Spock! Do you have an alternative plan, Admiral? Kirk took a deep breath. Will it be safe? Nothing is totally safe, Admiral. It is reasonably safe, yes. Kirk nodded. But suppose we give them the saline solution, and then they become reinfected by others. It means we must isolate each one until he or she recovers. That means we must do it as quietly as possible until we can build a force of recovered victims. If the saline solution works, you mean? All right, let's do it. 2 hypos, 1 with saline, 1 with vitamins. Mr. Sulu, report to the captain's quarters, Uhura said from her station on the bridge. Sulu nodded and got up, motioning to a relief navigator to take his place. The door hissed open and Sulu entered. Sir, he said, looking at Admiral Kirk. Mr. Spock was to his left. He saw Spock move and turned quickly. He saw the hypo coming at him, and he struck out with the cutting edge of his hand, but Spock dodged and thrust the hypo against his chest. There was a hissing pop, and Sulu staggered back. It seemed as though his chest was on fire. His heart pumped frantically, but it only sent the saline solution through his arteries to every part of his writhing body. Kirk stepped forward and stabbed the vitamin-loaded hypo into Sulu's arm. The young officer was yelling now, tearing at his chest. Spock leaned down and gave him the Vulcan nerve pinch. His body went limp, but here and there a muscle twitched. They dragged him into Kirk's inner bedroom and put him on the table. Kirk thumbed the intercom. Sick bay. McCoy. the familiar voice said. "Bones, please come to my quarters at once."
"Admiral, I'm very busy. Can we make it later?"
"Dr. McCoy, that's an order. Kirk out." Spock and Kirk looked at the bodies lying limply on the cabin floor. Sulu, McCoy, Leslie, Galloway, and Glazer, who were security officers, Yeoman Linda Chang, and Montgomery Scott. Kirk rubbed at his shoulder. Scott had put up quite a fight, knocking the hypo from Spock's hand. None of them had regained consciousness. "Not enough yet," Kirk said, looking at a chronometer. "And we're running out of time." "Mr. Chekhov has the con," Spock said. If we revive Mr. Sulu, and if he's cured," Kirk added wryly, "then you and he could return to the bridge and relieve Chekhov and one other." Kirk nodded. With a dubious expression, helped Spock revive Hikaru Sulu. The young man awoke, and his slack features winced in pain. "Ow, I'm on fire." Then he looked around at the reclining figures and got a puzzled expression. "Admiral, what's going on?" "You've been ill. Now I want you to help us." The turbolift hatch opened, and Kirk and Sulu strode onto the bridge. "I have the con, Mr. Chekhov," Kirk said. "It's all right, Captain. I can handle it. We're almost to our destination." "Mr. Chekhov, I am relieving you. Report to Dr. McCoy for your physical." "Physical, sir? Captain, I just—" "Do as you're ordered, Mr. Chekhov, at once." He turned toward the beautiful black woman at the communication station. "Lieutenant Commander Uhura, report to Mr. Spock for special duty." "Sir, What has happened to discipline?" Kirk roared. "I've given you an order." Uhura blinked and rose, motioning over a screen monitor midshipman to take her place. But instead of exiting through the turbolift, she got behind Kirk and attacked him. With a wild, wordless scream, she jumped on him and put both hands across his face. Kirk felt a tingling heat and fought back, digging an elbow into Uhura's stomach. But the maddened woman seemed possessed of superhuman strength, and she and Kirk fell to the floor in a tangle. Sulu karate chopped Chekhov as the assistant navigator got up, then delivered him a kick, knocking him back. A Russian fell over the kicking legs of the two on the floor, struck his head, and went limp. 3 of the crew at stations charged Sulu. He was sent stumbling back by the weight of the bodies, but recovered and punched one of the weapons control people in the stomach, doubling her over. Kirk fought free of Uhura's scratching hands and reluctantly put a hard fist to her jaw. She arched up and then collapsed. Kirk scrambled to his feet to use the momentum of the midshipman who came at him from Uhura's station to send him crashing into the opposite railing. The young man recovered and came back, but Kirk flipped him and knocked him unconscious. He whirled to help Sulu, but saw the young officer dispatch the last of the attackers. They paused for a moment, surveying the carnage, and Kirk took out the saline solution hypo, and Sulu brought out the more compact vitamin-loaded hypo. They methodically went from crewman to crewman, putting the hypos into their flesh. Then Kirk said, "Computer, this is Order 101 Alpha Omega. Seal the turbolifts to the bridge, deactivate the auxiliary controls, and prepare to execute Order 101 Beta Omega." "Completed. Ready to execute Order 101 Beta Omega." "Exception to Order 101 Beta Omega, sickbay in the quarters of Commander Spock." The bridge was automatically exempt. "Understand." "Execute Order 101 Beta Omega." Throughout the ship, hatches slammed shut and sealed. The airlocks to the exterior of the ship locked. Turbolifts stopped, and Morpheus 9 was piped into the ventilation system. Crewmen caught at their throats, gagged, and fell over unconscious. Kirk looked at his chronometer. The minutes seemed like hours, a cliché whose truth was all too painful for Admiral James T. Kirk. "Computer, void Order 101 Beta Omega and Order 101 Alpha Omega. Order completed." "Mr. Sulu, will you see to the crew with the others?"
"Aye, sir."
The young officer paused.
"Sir, I did follow procedures."
"I know, Mr. Sulu." He turned in his chair and looked at the guilt-ridden officer. "There's always a wild card, Mr. Sulu. Sometimes more than one." He waved him on. "Go. Then come back here and set the course right."
"Aye, sir."
Sulu left, and Kirk turned toward the main screen. Stars. The stars were not endless, but for all practical purposes, they might as well have been. Millions of them in any quadrant of the sky, and some of those points of light were other galaxies with their billions of stars. and each with its secrets. Nature had created limitless variety, and all sought survival and perpetuity, as was their right. Kirk thought, but why do they all jump on us? Then he smiled, for he'd have it no other way.